Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Sarah Cott, Senior Vice President of Programming at The Hill. Thank you for joining us in person this morning, and thank you to everyone joining us online for our event, Clean Energy Permitting Reform, The Path Ahead. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Advanced Energy United, for their support of this discussion. We're here today to discuss the impact and way forward following the bipartisan mini-deal and compromise permitting reforms that were part of the latest debt ceiling agreement. In just a moment, we'll hear from lawmakers, clean energy experts, and executives on topics such as renewable energy, infrastructure deployment, and reaching clean energy goals, and the outlook for greater reforms. Before we get underway, a few housekeeping notes. If you're with us here in the room, please keep your phones on silent and for the duration of the program, and please join the conversation on social media. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at The Hill Events. And with that, I am delighted to welcome Bob Cusack, Editor-in-Chief of The Hill, to the stage. He will introduce our first guest. Good morning.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for being here so early. I want to introduce our great first panel. We've got a lot of great discussions for this morning. The first topic will be electric transmission, and I'd like to first welcome Zan Fishman, Director of Energy Policy and Carbon Management at the Bipartisan Policy Center, Maria Robinson, Director of the Grid Deployment Office at the Department of Energy, and Kyle Davis, Senior Director of U.S. Federal Policy and Enel North America. Please note, Enel is a member of Advanced Energy United, the sponsor of today's event. I want to go down the line, starting with you, Zan, even though I just introduced you. Just talk a little bit about your group or your agency or office and what you'd like to see the world look like down the road, but in just 2 minutes or so.
2 minutes for a massive, broad vision statement.
Exactly.
So I'm with the Bipartisan Policy Center. We're a Washington, D.C.-based think tank that is focused on finding pragmatic solutions to some of the most difficult to solve problems facing our country. I'm on the energy program, and so for us, we're looking at how to get to net zero by 2050 in a way that is consistent with achieving lower cost energy, energy reliability, energy security, and American leadership. And we've really been focused in this permitting space because it's just ripe for bipartisan agreement and compromise because there's so much for each side to get. Maybe I'll stop there and limit it to my 2 minutes, but I'll want to talk a lot more about permitting reform and transmission because it's my favorite topic these days.
It is one of my favorite topics also, so excited to be here with you. I'm Maria Robinson. I head up the Grid Deployment Office, which is one of the new offices at the Department of Energy. The Department of Energy historically has been focused on research and development, but now we have this new deployment mission post-Bill and IRA passing. And so our goal is to work on all things transmission and distribution systems, no big deal. And we've been given about $26 billion to help do that. But in addition to that, we have a lot of interesting new authorities that we'll talk about later when it comes to permitting as well as planning and trying to bring together different folks to help tackle this problem. And to answer your question, because I'm a strict rule follower, I do work for the federal government, is that we just want to build a lot of transmission, but not unnecessary transmission. And I think that's a key component to this conversation.
Okay, we'll talk about that.
Sure. Thank you for the invitation to speak today. Kyle Davis with Enel North America. Enel is a large multinational energy company headquartered out of Rome, Italy. We're primarily known as a utility owner and operator. Unfortunately, all the utilities are overseas. In the United States, we are strictly a large-scale renewables project developer. We do demand response. We work with our commercial industrial customers on demand response. We do microgrids, and we also have an electric vehicle charger company. So we do what I call all the bright, shiny objects in North America, but our mindset is that of a utility owner-operator. So,
Maria, let's go back to the transmission issue. Can you kind of lay out the case? Why must the U.S. build more transmission, and can you talk about the unnecessary transmission that you mentioned?
Sure. So First of all, load is growing for the first time in the United States for decades now. And that's been something that we haven't necessarily had to tackle. Historically, we've watched load go down. And now we're dropping these great factories across America, and we have to figure out how to connect them to power. And that's incredibly important to make sure that the transmission is actually going there. Not to mention the system is becoming more distributed with renewables being on the system, or not just renewables, potentially even SMRs moving forward, like all different types of distributed systems. And we want to make sure that they can connect to the grid. Now, part of this is transmission is not cheap. I think that's something that we can all agree on. And we want to make sure that we're planning appropriately, whether it's across different regions or across different state lines, to make sure that we're doing it really efficiently and cost effectively for the American people, so that no one is paying for lines that are duplicative or unnecessary as well.
Zen, can you talk about the deal in the debt limit showdown? Now, obviously, the parties came together, but now there's disagreement over the deal, and obviously permitting reform was part of that equation, and where we go from here.
Absolutely. So first of all, really glad that that debt limit deal came together, the Fiscal Responsibility Act, because first of all, not going over a debt limit cliff, big win.
Right.
But if we just focus on the permitting provisions, the challenge there was, how do you come to a consensus on a set of permitting provisions that was big enough to be worth doing, but left enough on the table that both Democrats and Republicans wanted to come back for a second round, a second bite at the apple? Because with the time ticking, the clock ticking on the debt limit, there just wasn't enough time to get all the details right on a big comprehensive permitting bill, which is what we need. So they had something smaller, more modest, but good. It took us a nice, solid couple of steps forward, giving us timelines, one federal decision, agencies coordinating with each other, just some of the simple, basic, common sense permitting reforms that we've just needed. And historically, our permitting situation has been comically bad. Like, if I were to describe it to you, you would just laugh and say, that can't possibly be right. But it was right. Like, agencies didn't talk to each other. They argued with each other. It wasn't clear who was responsible for what. They would duplicate each other's work using different models. They would disagree about how to handle that. There would be no dispute resolution mechanism. Like, they just sit there in disagreement and just agree to disagree and not do anything. There was no deadlines. It was not a system that was built for success. So we've taken some steps forward, but there's a lot more we need to do. The bill didn't do anything on transmission, and we should talk about what can be done on transmission. It didn't do anything on judicial review. Permitting, that's some of the delays, but a lot of the delays actually happen after the permitting process is over and projects are sued and taken to court, and that can last, indefinitely.
What do you think should happen in that situation? What should be the judicial review?
Well, so now we're getting into the details, and what I'll say is that there are a lot of options for transmission. There are a lot of options for judicial review, and it's a little simplistic to say this, but by and large, the transmission is a priority for the Democrats, and judicial review is a priority for the Republicans. And the deal at the end of the day has to balance, right? Transmission, you can do something on siting, you can do something on cost allocation, you can do something on minimum transfer. Judicial review, you can do something on standing, you can do something on the way the courts themselves operate, where cases go. You can do statute of limitations. You can dial those up and down, more aggressive and less aggressive, which is what actually makes me really optimistic that Democrats and Republicans can come back to the table and find a deal that balances, that makes everybody happy enough that they're willing to go to permitting reform round 2. And there's a lot of other things that you can add on too. There's more NEPA things that you can do, more programmatic review, more categorical exclusions. You can add on tech-specific things, geothermal, hydropower, critical minerals. You can improve public engagement. You can really see a nice bill coming together. But the core of it, I think, is judicial review and transmission and pipelines. And the current disparity between transmission and pipelines is really interesting. And as we get into the details of what transmission permitting would look like, I think we should talk a little bit more about that.
Kyle, what would you like to see Congress and/or the administration do in this space?
Well, I think it's really critical. Well, first of all, let me back up. It's It's good news that people are even uttering the word transmission in the halls of Congress. For those of us that have been working on this issue for over 10 years or so, it is refreshing. I think the hope is that we can get some real fundamental movement in sort of comprehensive transmission investment strategy for the United States. I think a lot of people, if you talk about transmission, they make some assumptions about how it's done today. I think they believe somebody is getting together in a room with others and coming up with the most strategic way to invest scarce electricity customer dollars to build the transmission system that we'll likely need in the future. That isn't the case right now. It's actually done more on an ad hoc basis and based on real-time need, not forecasted need. And so we think there's some efficiencies that can be made in not only the planning side of things, where you're planning for the transmission build-out, not for the transmission that you need today, but for the transmission you'll need in 10 years when you're thinking about things like industrial electrification or electric transportation, things of that nature. And then on the permitting side, we think there's opportunities. Some of it was achieved in the debt ceiling deal, but we think they can go a little bit further in not only streamlining the federal side of permitting, especially for permitting of projects on federal lands, but then also working with the states, provide the states the tools to help them improve their process and become more efficient. Department of Energy has done some great projects developing tools, for example, for the installation of rooftop solar, creating an app that local communities can use. And so that's sort of an example where federal dollars could really benefit state and local municipalities in helping streamline their processes. And then the last one, which is probably the most controversial and really cannot be done at the local level, and that's paying for transmission. And we really think the federal government has to be able to help the different regions use the same sort of tools to be able to judge the value of different projects, be able to talk in the same language. Right now, you might have one region that values interregional transmission one way, and they use a different set of modeling tools and a different set of modeling assumptions, and then the region adjacent to them that's on the other end of that interregional transmission line uses something completely different. So when they do their analysis, they might be fruit, apples and oranges, but they're not matching up. And so there's a way for the federal government to help normalize sort of the tools that folks will use to look at the value of interregional transmission and get all the regions talking in a common language. There's some lessons to be learned from Europe about how they go about doing interregional transmission planning. We always talk about the United States someday having a macro grid, which would be the ideal, but I don't think we're ready to go that far. So we would like to see a very serious conversation on, as my friend Rob Gramlich likes to call it, the 3 Ps: planning, permitting, and paying for transmission. That's what we would like to see.
Go ahead,
If you don't
jump
mind.
in, Maria.
So I just want to respond to things both teams have said over here. So the Department of Energy, and we think of it as planning, permitting, and commercial facilitation, because I don't want anyone to think that the federal government is paying for all the transmission lines, and that's important for us. We don't have quite that much money. And so from the planning side, it's really getting more folks to the table to have these conversations. You would assume that everyone at the state level would be talking to each other. That is not the case, right? Each individual utility commission has their own jurisdiction, has their own rules, and that makes it really complicated. And not at, right, the same state could be in 2 different RTOs. And that can also make it really complicated because you're trying to cross the seams there within the same state. When it comes to the federal side of things, the Department of Energy back in May worked with 9 other agencies across the federal government to sign an MOU so we can start utilizing this unused section of the Federal Power Act from the Energy Policy Act of 2005. For those who want to dig into the text, that's section 216H, but we're calling it Site App. As a program. And so that allows the Department of Energy to take the lead on transmission permitting for the federal government. So that means that we can corral all of our federal family and work together to try and get those permits. And it does allow for the president, it's backing up, it allows for us to set a schedule and the schedule with a timeline of about 2 years, which is significantly shorter than what it currently takes to permit transmission lines within the federal government, and then allows the president to actually issue any permits that are not fully issued after those 2 years. The goal is to not ever use that part of the provision. The goal is to get everyone organized enough, and that's something that we're really excited about. It takes a lot of the principles that Zan was mentioning before, but there are still more certainly to be done as well.
Toward the end of this session and the next, we'll have some great questions that were sent in, but I only had 1 cup of coffee and I left them backstage. So if one of my colleagues can get them as we continue this discussion, that'd be great. Kyle, I want to go back to you on, you said lessons from Europe. What are the lessons that we could learn?
Well, they do essentially interregional transmission planning. So what they'll try and do is they'll leverage the different generation resource mixes of different countries. And instead of allowing each individual country to have its own transmission strategy with no thought of interconnecting to the adjacent country, they are taking a regional approach, an interregional approach. So they're able to take advantage of, not only diurnal but seasonal differences in electricity productions in different parts of Europe that benefits and flows across Europe. They are also developing with their pretty significant investment in offshore wind, what is essentially acting as interregional transmission for wind development there, because you have transmission lines obviously to serve the offshore wind project, but they can also substitute as that interregional transmission, allow flow of electricity beyond just that wind farm. So they're also doing a lot on HVDC investment, more so than the United States has done historically. So there's some lessons to be learned there. They've been very good at sort of testing out and demonstrating and commercializing some of the new technologies that can make existing transmission more efficient. We've been building that track record in the United States. This is the idea of grid enhancing technologies gets. So there are lessons to be learned. I don't think we need to look at the United States and the pace that we're undertaking different efforts to improve the transmission system as the be-all and end-all. There are examples that we can look to overseas and learn from other countries' experiences.
Zan, thank you. As far as the politics of it, you were talking about the debt limit, okay? There were a lot of critics of that debt limit, both on the left and the right, though it did get over 300 votes in the House. Can you talk about the politics of coming up with solutions? Because there are many problems in this area, and the clock is kind of ticking.
Clock is ticking. So let's start with the problems that we're trying to solve, and then you can kind of see the incentives that each side has to come back together. So let's start with the climate side of things,
yeah.
And then we'll move to the economic side of things. From the climate side of things, modeling shows that in order to get the emissions benefits of the clean energy tax credits from the Inflation Reduction Act, we're going to need to build out our transmission at more than twice our current pace. And if instead we continue at our status quo pace of building out transmission, only 20% of the emissions benefits will actually be realized.
Now, what does that mean practically for people watching online and big picture?
Practically, it means in order to achieve emissions reductions, we're going to need to build out a lot of clean energy. In order to make that work, we need to build out a lot of transmission. And if it takes years and years and years to permit things, before you even start building, you're just sticking with our current infrastructure. And our current infrastructure, our status quo is not great. If I were to tell you right now, compared to 20 years ago, do you think that we have more blackouts or fewer blackouts? You might think, we're the United States of America, where we have grown technologically. We've made progress. Quality of life has improved. We clearly have fewer blackouts, but that would be false. We have twice as many blackouts as we used to have.
Twice.
Right?
Wow.
Right? I mean, that's crazy. The United States of America.
Yeah.
So, when we're thinking about, the economics of it, we also need this build out in order to reduce energy costs. That's a good bipartisan issue. To increase energy reliability. And also energy security, right? If we're thinking about geopolitics, our energy security is a really big piece of this. And if we can't build in the United States of America, because projects are delayed for so many years, then we're stuck with our status quo. And our status quo is supply chains not super reliable, our energy grid less reliable than it used to be, right? This is a big problem, and that's why Democrats and Republicans have a clear incentive to come to the table. And they have different priorities within the bill, right? Democrats are focused more on the transmission pieces for emissions reasons, though there are clear reasons that Republicans should also be interested in transmission, and I think many of them are. It's just getting the details right about how you actually modify what you do. And then judicial review, being caught up in the courts for years and you have no idea when it will end. One of the main principles that I think you need to consider with both permitting and judicial review is you just want some degree of certainty that the process will conclude. Will you get to yes? Will you get to no? I don't know. That's actually less important than will the process conclude, and you can either start building or move on.
And I think a big part of this also is tied up with the supply chain, right? So one of the things that you mentioned is the European governments, and you mentioned the geopolitical aspect. What we've seen post-Ukraine is that these European governments that own their utilities are getting in line for HVDC. These lines are 10 years long now. You had to put down billions of dollars to hold your place in line in the first place. And our American utilities can't compete with that. I don't have the tools to be able to put down money on behalf of the federal government in order to hold our place in line for HVDC. And because our permitting system is not super efficient and no one knows when it's going to conclude, it's really hard for developers and utilities to put down that type of money without ever knowing when it's going to end. So they're all tied up with each other.
Yeah, and I just want to add 3 discrete issues, and you'll probably be surprised that you're hearing this, excuse me, from a renewables developer, because it's not going to touch on decarbonization. One, we have an aging grid. We actually have quite a bit of transmission that is reaching the end of its useful life, so we're actually in this opportune time to either replace it with what currently is there, like for like, or we can upgrade it. So the fact that we've got a lot of transmission that's aging out and needs to be replaced, we've got this existing right-of-way, we can do things like reconductoring, where we can increase the amount of transfer capacity on those existing transmission routes. But the challenge is the way regulatory system is set up, utility commissions are incentivized to replace like for like. We have to find a way to encourage the states to approve the local utilities to be able to upgrade those transmission lines when you're going through the process of having to replace the line anyway. Similarly, we have an opportunity for the existing transmission system to introduce those grid-enhancing technologies. The problem is that utilities make most of the rate of return on new capital investment, and they're not really set up in the regulatory structure to be incentivized to make the existing assets more efficient. So we've got to figure out a way that we can motivate utilities to invest in those grid-enhancing technologies. And then the last one I just want to make a point on, this is really an argument for new transmission. We're one of those companies that announced plans to build some new domestic manufacturing. We're looking to build some solar cells and solar panels in the state of Oklahoma. And we looked at a whole bunch of states, and I could tell you one of the critical requirements for that new domestic manufacturing is availability of adequate electricity supply. Transmission investment, particularly new transmission investment, is absolutely critical for rural economic development and job creation. So you can't think of transmission as a tribal partisan issue like some people are trying to do. I know it's setting up leverage for negotiations over siting and permitting reform, but there's a lot of bipartisan support for transmission for issues other than decarbonization. There are wonderful spillover effects from investing in our grid. It is the greatest invention the world has ever seen, our US electricity system. It's aging out. It's an opportunity for us to improve upon what's already been built in the years ahead.
I do want to get to a question. We're running out of time. Could you answer this one? This is from Mary Ellen Millers, Commissioner of Wayne County Soil and Water Conservation District. And her question is, given that we all want to move away from gasoline-powered autos, now we'll be able to, in sparsely populated areas, to provide charging access for all the new electric vehicles.
So this is part of why we need transmission in order to accommodate the deep electrification, right? Folks are very excited about moving to electric, whether it is in heat pumps. I will say personally that my moving to a heat pump over this summer, my electric bill has gone down by 1/5, or is down to 1/5 of what it was before, which is huge for our family at least. And so this has been one of the areas where we are struggling to make sure that our our infrastructure can conform. Now, a lot of that's going to be more on the distribution system side of things, where we also have to do a massive amount of upgrades. But at the same time, making sure that there are enough electrons of any color going through the system in order to meet those needs, because people are interested in it at a consumer level.
I could speak specifically on that issue because...
Just briefly, we got about a minute left.
Real quick, DC fast chargers in rural areas is going to be really difficult because the distribution system grid is usually not set up for that type of industrial load. You can either upgrade the transmission system, or what we're seeing a lot of developers, including Enel, that does these public charging stations, is co-locate battery energy storage. So that when you do have an electric vehicle coming in and drawing that much electricity in a short period of time, rather than putting stress on the distribution grid, you have the battery there that can supply that short spurt of electricity demand. Now, it's a little bit different set of solutions in urban communities, but that is something that we've been looking at in rural communities.
Zan, 30 seconds, give you last word.
Last thing is that we can do legislation. We can do bipartisan legislation. There's some pushing right now to just have FERC handle transmission. And I understand that. You know, it's always easy to be cynical and say Congress can't do anything, but Congress can do something here. The incentives are clearly there, and the FERC solution is less good. You want policy certainty and regulatory certainty in order to make these long-term investments. And flip-flopping back and forth between various FERC majorities is not the right solution when we can actually have policy certainty from legislation, and then FERC can step in and we have a clear path forward into the future.
Yep. Well, we've run out of time. Please thank our great panel today. Thank you for joining us. Thank you so much.